Do you ever wonder how great leaders in the community make things happen? When they encounter new, unexpected challenges like a pandemic, how do they continue to successfully make an impact? Welcome to That Sounds Terrific, the podcast that connects you with these amazing people. Get insights on what they do to meet their goals, find out how you can help them in their mission, and learn their methods so you can be more successful at what you do. Welcome to That Sounds Terrific with host Nick Koziel.
Welcome back, everyone, to an episode of That Sounds Terrific. I have another terrific guest, Nikki Murphy, who is an author of Home for Hurricanes. I'm so happy to have you on the show. And of course, I always forget to introduce myself. I am Nick Koziel, the host of That Sounds Terrific. And this episode, we are going to dive into poetry and prose. So, Nikki, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, it's great. I mean, I haven't had any authors on the show and about their books anyway. And so you're first for That Sounds Terrific. But I went back and forth, honestly. I'm like, should I get this book and read it first and then ask her questions, or should I kind of come in blind? And I chose the come in blind thing because I think I didn't want to lead you on your own story. So
yeah.
So Nikki, can you tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're from and kind of how you decided to actually, become an author and write this book?
Sure. So I'm born and raised out in Long Island from a small town called Wyandanch, predominantly Black, low income. And I grew up there, and it had an indelible print on who I became as a person. After graduating from that school, Wyandanch High School, I went on to college and studied finance, ultimately graduating with a finance degree and entering into my Wall Street career. So writing was the furthest thing away from my mind at that time. It was just about, how do I make money? How do I change the trajectory of my family's income and things like that? So I was just so dead set on traditional measures of success, right? Money, accolades, Wall Street. And so I was so infatuated with breaking this barrier. And I started my corporate career at a accounting firm, one of the big four accounting firms. And I was consulting, and I really had no fulfillment from the job. But I would supplement, I had a very strong heart for mentorship, and particularly in underserved communities. So I would lead our mentorship program at the company at high schools in New York City. I would do whatever I could to volunteer and mentor younger students that were maybe from similar backgrounds. And I always, kept writing, mostly journaling, some poems here and there. And then I created 2 blogs. Still hadn't called myself a writer, but I was blogging, about personal finance, this topic that I was so passionate about, financial literacy. And ultimately, after it took the shootings of Alton Sterling and a couple of other shootings that happened in that time frame around 2016 for me to actually decide to transition my daytime career into diversity and inclusion, one that could have more impact in these issues that I cared about. So I started to make that transition to find full-time employment in diversity and inclusion, and ultimately became corporate vice president of diversity and inclusion at a Fortune 100 financial institution. And then George Floyd happened, Breonna Taylor, all these murders happened in 2020 that then prompted me to make a similar pivot, where I am now using my voice, expertise, and platform to speak, write, and tell stories, particularly around the Black community, and have my voice heard on a broader scale than just in a corporate context. So I'm very much in this process of living out this evolution of, coming full circle and coming back to the communities and causes that I care about.
Yeah. You're actually the second guest to come on our show that was on Wall Street or in a similar fashion, and that was just not happy.
Right.
And so
I'm not surprised.
So I think I made the right decision not going to Wall Street, although that decision I think was made for me because I didn't graduate with a business degree or kind of even go in that direction. But I think it's very admirable what you've decided to do. And even the first kind of pivot out of the Wall Street part, because
Mhm.
you have this love for numbers and finance, which is great, but you weren't fulfilled. And it's so much better to like work a job that doesn't feel like a job, right?
Yeah.
So like not a lot of people can say that they do that. um
Right.
and so outside looking in, me just really getting to know you, I really love the fact that you kind of took charge of that moment and decided, this is not what I want to do, and here's something more of what I think I want to do, right? So
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about the feelings that you had during that transition, and like, what was the thing that finally pushed you to make that leap?
Well, the thing that pushed me to make the leap now, when I left my corporate career to now be an author and speaker, was, I was dealing with so much personally due to the pandemic, also due to all the issues surrounding race and social justice in 2020, and navigating that reality in my family, my community. And then we lost family members to coronavirus. We also had my son home. I have a 5-year-old who was being homeschooled now, and I'm trying to manage this. Meanwhile, my job was in the highest of high demand, right? Like it
Yeah.
was just so needed at that time. And I was managing a team, and I just felt like I didn't have a break. And also, I felt very much stifled
Mhm.
in what I could say and do because I was representing the company and
Right.
not representing Monique. So just feeling like I didn't have a voice, but ultimately feeling also that my life was no longer aligned with my values. And that to me has always signaled that there's a time to make some change, is when, I value freedom, I value autonomy, I value speaking and writing and thought. And so I'm just like, oh, I feel like I'm getting less and less of that. And I need to find a way to create some more freedom in my life. And we were, blessed financially that we had some reserve and we invest in real estate. So we have some properties that were able to supplement income so that we could make that decision for me to
Mhm.
step away from work and pursue writing the book without something already lined up. Like I didn't have a book deal, I self-published.
Right.
Um, so doing all of that, took some risk, but it's been amazing. And again, I just didn't want to sit with that pain of being in a place where you've outgrown, it's time to move on, and then still feeling conflicted, about like, am I leaving at the right time? Do they really, like, this is when they
Mhm.
probably need me the most? Am I abandoning my team? And things like that. So I had a lot of factors to weigh, but ultimately aligning my values to my life is what I stand for and what I help to empower others to do now.
Mhm.
So I had to make that move.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. And first of all, I'm sorry for your family's loss. That,
Oh,
loss at any
thank
time is difficult, and COVID affected so many lives in so many different ways. So
yes,
wanted
yes.
to make sure I acknowledged that. And
Thank you.
and with COVID, like, there's sort of this age, new age of like renaissance almost, that like people
Yes.
like yourself and even me to some degree are kind of going back to either their roots or going back to creativity. Okay.
Mhm.
And I've witnessed it, with a couple people that I'm very close to as well. Like, and people are just living life a little bit more brighter and
I
a
think
little bit
so.
truer to their compass, right? With all the things that were sort of a negative connotation, right? Like around some of the things that were happening. Um, it was nice to have a little bright side too, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I did want to ask a little bit more about the corporate life before we kind of delve more into the book,
Yes.
because something struck a chord, and so you were saying that you couldn't be Monique, right? Because there's this
Right.
company line. So in a position such as yours, and diversity and trying to like implement different programs and partnerships and things like that, um, did you find yourself like really like teetering on that line of what is, I guess, right for the company, but also what is really truly right for society?
Yes. So I did find myself on that line, but I'm very understanding, and so I've been in a corporate context long enough to know that there's only a certain amount of progress that's going to happen. There's only a
Hmm.
certain amount of buy-in that you're never going to have like radical solutions
Right.
happen overnight. Like it's just not the way these corporate institutions work. So I did have a lot of patience in dealing with this and understanding that, although it may not be what I would personally want to do or far enough, I was able to do the best that I could and see the company's efforts for as much as it could do comfortably. Um, but yeah, I think in this time, in particular in 2020, for me, I did feel very much like there was more that I would love to see done, and really was balancing this, having to talk to people about being patient, not being patient, but almost like this is what we're doing the best that we can, and all of these things, like having this message as corporate hat and having this message, which is important, and people do have to realize that these things are not going to happen overnight. But then personally being like, I really just want to like, be there with you
Right.
and champion these things. But I think, the people that I worked with, all of my colleagues appreciated that they know me as a person and what I
Hmm.
stand for, and they respected what I was working toward. So that's always
Hmm.
good, and to have that
Yeah.
understanding.
And that was another question I was going to ask you. You already answered for me. So, like, how was the support from
Yeah, no,
coworkers?
it
And
was great. It
yeah,
was great.
well, that's great. Well, I do want to hear more about how you came to start like putting this book together. What was your process, and how did you sort of discover your voice?
Yeah, so this book kind of happened by accident. I say God tricked me into writing it because I had, back in 2017, taken a sabbatical from work.
Mhm.
I was burnt out. I was suffering from anxiety and depression that was largely work induced.
Mhm.
And I was up for promotion to senior manager, had built my case around a rule that was going to be repealed if Trump took office. And then he took office. And then my book of business just completely vanished. And so did the case for my promotion. So I
Mhm.
was really going through it. And I, wanted to quit. And so I came in and gave my notice, but partners talked to me about just taking a sabbatical, taking some time away, and thinking about it. So in that 6 months that I took away from work, I volunteered, but then I also started writing poetry.
Mhm.
And I didn't set out to write poetry at all. I was just actually trying to develop a financial literacy education program that I could shop to different schools, because I felt very passionate about financial literacy being a part of high school
Mhm.
curriculum. And so I was working on that. And then at night, I would just get like these downloads of information and thoughts. And I'm like, okay, grabbing my phone, grabbing my notebook, and just writing out almost like a stream of consciousness, writing out. And it just happened to be in poem form.
Mhm.
So I had all of these poems that I'd written. I didn't want to lose poetry when it was time for me to go back to work. And I decided I was going to make that transition to diversity and inclusion. And I knew I'd be starting a new career and I wouldn't have time to write, but I didn't want to lose it. But then it was in 2019 that, I just had this thought, this revelation on the Long Island Railroad commuting to work. And it was like, you have all of these poems you've written, you should make a book with those poems. And I'm like, no, I don't think I have enough for a book. And I'm having this conversation in my head with God, like, I don't think I can make a book. And no, you already have it. And so I went through and I looked at my poems and I thought I had this book all together, organized it. And then something fantastic happened. So I started writing more now that I was revisiting this poetry. and it ended up morphing into, now it's probably like 90% new poems. Meanwhile, I thought it was this minor effort of me just compiling all these past poems, because if I would have known that I had to write the book, I wouldn't have done it, right?
Yeah.
Because I would have rationalized I'm too busy. But it worked out that way. And over the past year and a half, I wrote the book and then published it in November of 2020. So
Well, that's awesome.
that's how I got tricked into it.
Tricked into it. God on a train.
Yes.
Having a conversation. You're that lady on the train.
I'm that lady.
She's talking to somebody. No, that's great. I think that that's an awesome story. And to kind of go back and then, you know, discover that like the poems that you had for whatever reason weren't exactly what you wanted for the book, and to kind of just write it there. You just sort of find time to do the things that you love, right?
Yes.
You know, late at night when you're writing poetry down, or like a lot of musicians, like when they're writing songs, they have like a notebook or, you know, even a recorder next to their, you know, bedstand, and they jump up in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. and start playing something or writing something down. So
yes.
just
Absolutely. And for me, it was taking also poetry books. I was reading poetry books on the train now to work, so that that would inspire a poem, and then I'd write it down. Also, I started making the time. So I knew I couldn't get up any earlier. I had to put my son on the bus and all these things. But I figured out I can catch the next earliest train. There was a way, and it would get me there 30 minutes before I had to be at work. And instead of just getting to work 30 minutes early, I stopped at a local hotel that I passed by on my walk to work, and I would write in their lobby for 30 minutes. And then awesome. it just worked out. So,
and you probably came to work like ready to go then, right? Like a different centered frame of mind. That's
yes. Although sometimes it was also like racing, because I had kind of was in a flow and didn't want to get up.
I don't want to stop.
Right. And then I'm like running to the office and flustered, but
yeah. No,
but I did it right. I was
centered. That's awesome though. Like to you know, and then again, like do you ever think about, you know, not knowing where you're doing your book signings and book announcements and speaking? Do you ever think about going to that lobby of that hotel and having an event there?
I never even thought about that. You know what? I haven't even thought about in-person anything, because I had done it virtually, you know, when I launched and everything, but that makes so much sense. I should. It was actually the Ace Hotel in Manhattan. I'll have to see. I don't think I was supposed to be squatting there in their lobby, but occasionally I would buy a green juice from the
well, then you're just very stealthy about it, and you just kind of go up to them and say, hey, you know, I have a friend that wrote a book in your lobby, and we were wondering, and then I'm like, wait, were they squatting in our library? I just said library, but I meant lobby. But yeah, no, I think that would be a neat idea. A neat idea. You know, you heard it here first, and that sounds terrific. And Ace Hotel, if that was not legal, she didn't do it. I don't know what you're talking about.
I did not.
I'll edit that part out. So does your poetry follow any particular like style, or is it kind of just free flowing?
It's free verse. There are only a couple of poems that have some rhyme scheme, so the most of it does not rhyme. It's free verse. I have a couple of list poems, but for the most part, it's just all free verse and how it came to me, and then revised it. And also because I'm not a trained writer or poet. So I started to learn a lot more about poetry after a lot of these poems were written.
Right.
And then for me to kind of fit it into a different format would play around too much with the meaning that I originally had. So I did not follow too many poetic forms.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when I write, and I haven't written a book, so I'm even another bigger step behind you, but it's the same thing. It's more free verse or just like a feeling, you know, and then you just kind of put all the feelings on the page. And I can totally also relate with going back and saying, hey, I have enough poetry here, or I have enough short stories here to kind of put a book together. And then I guarantee that I would go in there and be so self-critical about them. Like, I need to rewrite the whole entire thing.
Well, yes.
So we might have similar processes here.
I think so.
Except mine just hasn't really it started. So Nikki, I'm sure you get asked this on the times that you're talking, and I didn't give you any preparation for this at all. But would you be willing to read an excerpt from your book?
Sure.
Maybe
So
your
I'll tell
one
you
of
a
your
little bit about what
favorites?
the book is about, and then
Sure.
I'll read an excerpt from my almost, I guess it would be my favorite.
Okay.
So the book is Home for Hurricanes, and it is a coming of age story of my life. It's a memoir in poetry and prose, but it's a coming of age story that talks about parental abandonment,
Mhm.
love, loss, sexual assault, and healing. So it also has a lot of celebratory notes around Black girlhood and Black womanhood, and then also some of the more heartbreaking things, and takes a very critical lens of how we shape identities, particularly in marginalized communities,
Mhm.
and then how we foster what's called rape culture, right? All the little ways that we um, silence or perpetuate a society where boys are maybe allowed to do or have more liberties when it comes to girls and women.
Mhm.
So I will read this one that I think is it opens the hurricane chapter. So I have 4 chapters in the book. Home,
Okay.
which talks about more of my upbringing, that kind of urban environment, a lot of the joys of childhood and being raised by a single mom. And then closets, which are some of the things we don't want to talk about. Some things like religion and conversion. I converted to Islam when I was 16. So talking through some of these things, depression, anxiety, and then hurricanes, which talks to some of the storms that I've gone through, and then finally rebuilding, which is the
Mhm.
healing process. So this poem is called Daddy's Confession, and it opens that hurricanes chapter. I remember the day my daddy confessed. I was a post-college adult in the backseat of a car with both my reunited and newly introduced half-siblings, the partition between my whole father and I, and priest in the way that I absorbed the unfiltered confessions of my then chronically ill and spiritually transformed father. He reflects on his life not knowing it would be over in 5 short years. First, he warned, "You'll probably hate me for this." Then, without a pause to even momentarily debate sharing, he confessed sins against desperate women. If there was anything to hate you for, might it have been the years of my life that you were absent, not how you filled your time? Besides, I couldn't imagine it. Sure, he walked the neighborhood with a black and gold cane, gold rings on every finger, not to be overshadowed by the layers of gold chains donned around his neck like anchors, and years, dressed in one loud color from head to toe, topped with a Kangol hat for good measure. Yes, he looked the part, and people joked of it. Still, it was hard to read intimidation when he always beamed a shining, dumbfounded, gold tooth grin whenever he saw me, which was mostly every second Saturday in June, Wine Dance Day, when I walked over to him in the park and introduced myself. Hey. I'd pause uncomfortably for a few seconds while he tried to place where he knew me from. At my breaking point, it's Nikki. Then there it was, that wide, toothy grin and open embrace, like I was an unexpected Amazon package arriving on his doorstep without his recalling having ordered just the thing he'd been looking for. His not knowing me upon initial greeting was a running joke between my homegirl and I. We would laugh about it afterward in the way that teenagers laugh off the things that should hurt them. I'll stop there. It's a longer poem, um, but it ends with, "It would take me a while, years even, to understand that his karma found me even when he did not. So that was one of the poems that spoke to parental abandonment and this kind of relationship I had with my father when he came back into my life as an adult. But yes, it opens up what ends up being a rough time in college with men in particular.
That was very moving. Like I got chills.
Oh,
And I can
thank you.
hear it in your voice too, the, connecting with the emotion. And I honestly, like you were talking, I think before we started recording about getting ready to do the audio version. So
Yes,
that's probably,
it's out now.
it's out now. So,
Yes, it's on Audible and all the audiobook platforms.
well, I'm
So
definitely going to give it a listen too.
thank,
I like to read, but to hear it from your lips, to God's ears. I mean, it's just
yeah,
amazing.
thank you.
Yeah. So, I'd love to talk a little bit more about, you said there's four different distinct
Hmm.
chapters in the book. And we talked a little bit about your process, about how you came to write it. How did you decide to kind of split it up that way? Did it all sort of fall into place, or?
So I kept thinking about like that I did have these poems that seemed to be in different tranches. Like there was these poems that were more enlightened and spiritual and about healing, right? Because that kind
Mhm.
of represented where I was today. Um, but then there were these poems that came up again out of nowhere before I was going to bed and everything that really spoke to some of the trauma that I had been through that maybe I had compartmentalized and pushed to the back of my mind. So I
Mhm.
had these stories as well about the trauma. I had these stories about kind of this healing and evolution and kind of almost speaking from kind of my older self to my younger self, right? And then I had this other uh, poems that were just about the neighborhood and like growing up and having fun. And I was like, these could be separate books, and I could build out separate collections on each of these. But I think they tell the story
Mhm.
of how you go from, one particular environment and that, so I decided to frame out these chapters and they weren't home, closets, hurricanes, and rebuilding at first. It was like, growing, sprouting, like I was playing with
Mhm.
different things. But then when the metaphor home for hurricanes came to me, with just me being a home for hurricanes, meaning that I've gone through all of these storms, but typically people don't see that when they see me, right? They
Mhm.
see this professional woman, this person who's corporate vice president at this company, and you don't really understand what's behind people's cheery, lovely,
Mhm.
demeanor, and what they've been through. And so for me, that had always been something that was lacking in corporate and something
Mhm.
that I always went like, I'm so the person that's like, oh, I want to know your story. Like
Right.
I just, I'm so interested in people and how they've gotten to be the way that they are, and what they're interested in outside of work, what really drives them. And so I'd always be looking at people that are successful and never being able to envision myself there because they just seem so unhuman. or I was just like, oh, what's their story? Like, is there anyone here that's been through some things? Is there anyone here that's come from a neighborhood like I've come from? And so for me, writing the story, not knowing I was going to leave my job, but writing this story, and having this book come out, and then me being that professional, it's like, okay, well, people coming up, more junior professionals will be able to see that this is who I am,
Right.
and maybe it'll help them to be more of who they are and realize that they can take up space in this predominantly white male driven environment. Um, but I had no intentions on outlining it that way until I found this metaphor, and then it just kind of worked: home, closets, hurricanes, and rebuilding.
Mhm.
And I said, okay, this can all be one book. And some chapters were very, very light. And then that was where I ended up having to write a lot because I felt like, oh, I'm jumping from this to this. I have to say something about what happened in between.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you're so brave. I mean, to think
Really.
about it, you're putting your, entire soul into something that now is open to the world to read, and for, for better or for worse. And you have that intent to kind of explain, this is who I am, this is why
Yeah.
I am, right? And the hope is that people will interpret it that way.
Yeah.
And it's so true. Like, even then, you really don't know who a person is, right?
Right.
But you get a better window into who they are, and why they do what they do. And the other thing that I think that, readers are going to find from your book is that connection to different aspects of your, of where they are.
Yes.
Are they in the closet section? Are they in the middle of the hurricane? And
Right.
I could see someone really latching onto your book and really going, okay, she's felt what I'm feeling right now,
Yes.
connecting in
Yeah.
that way. And I know in a lot of ways, like what you're describing, and now I'm like, I should have read the whole thing. Because like, it's almost like a self-help book, right? Based upon
Yeah.
your experiences.
It is, and I toyed with that because I was kind of arguing, when I was putting together the book, and you call it brave, but at first it was like just this project, right? I didn't
Right.
know that it was going, like, in my mind I was like, okay, I know the type of person I am. I could back out of this at any point because there's no accountability here. I'm doing this on my own.
Hmm.
So I could turn around and not, just decide to keep it from me and my family.
Right.
But I had to start, because I wanted to be true to what I had been called to do. I started talking about it to people before it existed,
Hmm.
because then that created some kind of accountability. So I would say, I, although it looks brave, I was very scared during the process, because it was just like, and then
Hmm.
as it became more and more vulnerable, um, I was just like, okay, this is a lot. Um, do I do I release this all? Can I trust people with my story? Um, and then how are people going to receive it and react? And is it going to be, um, are people going to be critical of it because it's another, survival story, informed by trauma? And haven't we seen so much Black trauma? And, so just thinking about all of this nuance, but ultimately, everyone's going to have an opinion, but
Right.
I just have to be obedient in what I've been led to do. So it works out. And then, but I was scared the entire way until it became, and then up until, and continuing now, but into publication date, when it became real. And it's like, okay, people are going to read this. And then people were reading it and like, Monique, I read this, I had no idea you went through it. And I'm like, okay, now I have to talk about
Right.
with the people that know me, right?
Right.
Even my mom, we hadn't talked about a lot of this stuff. So us having to talk through that before the book was published, and
Hmm.
giving her a copy just so she could be prepared for her friends and people reading it. So it's
Yeah. And I
it
think you
was
just totally
scary.
described why I meant you're brave, because yeah, it was scary, but you went through it and you did it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the part that makes it like brave. And I was trying to think of like, what is that saying? And it might even be from like the Lion King, but it's like, you're not going out there looking for trouble. You're brave because you need to be.
Yeah.
And what I like about, your story and your book and what you're doing is that you the story needs to be told, right? It's
Mhm.
not just another story.
Right.
It's your
Right.
story, okay? And that's what I think you're really brave about. I don't have the same background as you, and no one really does have the same background. There's
Right.
similarities, right? But I'm not brave enough to kind of put things out on paper yet. This
Mhm.
podcast was started, an old friend of mine, a former supervisor, says, you need to start a movement. You just need to do something. And this
Yeah.
was a big leap for me, because I hadn't performed or done anything since college, musically, or putting my thoughts out there. And even now I hold back a little because, there is that fear that, what are people going to, you get the wrong person listening, or the wrong
Yeah.
person reading, what are they going to say?
But it's
that could
okay
hurt
as
you,
long as you're
right?
being true to yourself. And I feel like you can recover from a lot of things. Like there are very few things that are like beyond redemption, right?
Right.
So that's what I come back to too when I get a little bit in my head about that. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, well, I know what my intention was. So even if the impact may be off, or
Right.
I offended someone, I can always, circle back and explain where I was
Right.
coming from, and
It's an
yeah,
educational
they'll take it
moment,
or leave it. Right. Yes.
right? And that's the thing, is like, you don't know how everyone's going, because they have different experiences, and how are they going
Mhm.
to interpret your thoughts and stuff. So, I think it's wonderful what you've done. And
Thank you.
I'm sure that it's making a bigger difference than you even realize.
Yeah.
um you go back to moments in life where you talked a lot about going into schools and talking to them about finance and
Mhm.
financial literacy, but making those impacts on student lives, like 5-10 years from now, you might have someone come to you and say, hey, I knew nothing about finance or anything. I didn't even know what I wanted to do, but something you said clicked with me, and now
Mhm.
I'm CEO of this, or I'm doing this, and
Yeah.
I can trace it all back to that moment. And those are the moments that I think you're going to find more and more as your book is read.
Oh, I would love that. Those are the moments that I live for as a mentor, as someone who works. I volunteered with an organization called College Summit, an organization that I love.
Hmm.
Okay. And they do these summer workshops where you have students come to a college campus from a school. They usually work with schools that have low graduation rates, and they'll bring juniors onto a college campus for like a week-long intensive where you get them ready for college. We do personal statements. There are guidance counselor volunteers that look at their transcripts and get them to like 5 schools that they could apply to. Um, I was a writing coach, not knowing I would be a writer then, but you didn't have to be. They would
Yeah.
teach you this framework. But I was a writing coach for these students, and we'd have these 4-day, kind of intensive sessions where they would be telling their stories in a
Mhm.
way that would be compelling for a personal statement. And these kids had been through so much, and they just did not realize it because everyone around them was also going through so much. So they
Right.
didn't realize how profound it is that they even graduated high, are on track to graduate high school, having had all of these challenges. And so getting them to write this personal statements and seeing the emotion, seeing how fulfilled they get, and hearing their story read aloud at a banquet, and people being moved to tears and things. And that to me is like everything.
Mhm.
And it's so telling because I had to kind of draw on the inspiration or motivation that I was giving them at the time for me to even do what I'm
Mhm.
doing now. But you always think like, oh wow, everyone's going through something, or everyone's
Right.
doing what makes this so unique. But it's truly compelling in those instances. My prayer is that this book, reaches everyone that it needs to reach, and that it does help people to be, more introspective and inspired, toward healing and growth. And then as I talk about it and talk about resilience, um, that's also been really, really rewarding.
Yeah. And if you think about high school and communication between
Mhm.
two high school students is impossible. Okay.
Right,
And they're
right.
not telling, it's just surface, like what I like to say, it's like surface conversation. They're
Hmm.
talking about like what's on TikTok, what's on, what's going on,
Yeah.
but they're not talking about their feelings, especially with people that aren't their close friends. So
Yeah.
having them come and be able to write, and then realize that some of their, the people that they kind of know are going through the same things that they're going through,
Mhm.
is sort of an enlightening moment for,
Yeah.
for them, right?
Yeah.
Um, because I think back in high school and even middle school, and the trivial things that friends and popular kids and stuff fought about, right?
Yes.
And a lot of it was just out of like kind of ignorance,
Yes,
right? Or
absolutely.
fear. So
Yep,
so
definitely
just as another
fear.
great thing that you're doing. I love that giving students the opportunity to really express where they're coming from. And
Yeah.
I mean, part of the college experience, honestly, is finding yourself.
Yes.
And having those students do that so early on, like junior
Mhm.
year, will help them decide what they want to be when they grow up, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's great.
It's been so rewarding.
But so you've got some new steps that you're going to be taking with the
Yes.
book and the audiobook, and you're starting and have spoken on several occasions. But can
Mhm.
you talk a little bit about your public speaking and the
Sure.
kinds of places that you're looking to impact?
Absolutely. So I speak on the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is kind of my professional training.
Mhm.
Um, and then also on themes around the book. So resilience being one of the topics. So I do speak at a lot of academic institutions. So I've
Mhm.
spoken at high schools, um, open to speaking at various academic institutes. I also speak at a lot of corporate environments, particularly around race and gender, social justice. Just did a session recently for authentic allyship for social justice in this time. But I'm looking to work with an array of organizations, nonprofits included, and
Mhm.
dabbling into some consulting now as well, in addition to speaking. So I know a lot of times I'll get in there and I'll talk about a topic and then people want more.
Mhm.
Um, and a lot of the sessions that I do are not just delivering, but with more intimate crowds, we can do also conversations where we're having dialogues about race, about social justice, answering questions people may have, really sparking that conversation so that we can get to know each other a little bit better and what might be holding us back or making us feel silent, or some of us not feel seen. And so having that dialogue and then also providing some actionable solutions, right? What can we actually do and take away from this? So those are the topics that I
Mhm.
enjoy speaking on. I'm very much a proponent of doing life on purpose, so
Mhm.
living a purposeful life, aligning your career and life, being intentional about aligning that to your values. So that's what I enjoy. And I try to, I think all of the themes that I speak on in regards to diversity and inclusion and things like that also fall under kind of empowering people to do life on purpose with
Yeah.
intention.
That's awesome. No. And we'll be putting like all the notes in our episode notes for connection as far as all that goes. So like the speaking, the book will be there for sure,
Yeah.
and the link to the audiobook as well. So I strongly
Thanks.
suggest that our listeners and myself go and actually read the book. Um, like I'm still glad I did it this way because I think it
Yeah,
was a
because
better conversation.
mhm.
But you always feel guilty. I'm like, here I am talking to the author about her book, but I haven't read it yet.
But
Kind of
no,
feel like
it,
that guy that joins the book club and doesn't read the book and says,
and enjoys the discussion.
yes, this is a book about life and tribulations, and there's
No,
a
I
main
like this
character.
way though. It works out because I get your intention, and I've done another interview where other interviews where people read the book ahead of time and then it just becomes focused on what poems they like, and then
Passage.
I
Yeah.
just read those passages and then we have a discussion about that. But for listeners, it may not translate because they haven't read the book yet.
Right.
So it's a different perspective. So
Yeah. Well, I'm glad I changed it up for you a little bit. And is there anything, Nikki, that I didn't ask that you just definitely want our listeners to know about you or the book or really anything?
um nothing else that comes to mind about the book and myself. I know we've talked through quite a bit,
Right.
including my transition and kind of history to this point. So uh, I don't think there's anything else in particular that we haven't covered.
Hmm.
Um, I would just say, I would love to stay connected with your listeners, either through my website or on social media. Very excited to be able to share and discuss. I'm very open to discussing the book, for those that have read or are going to read it, and working with people on speaking at their organizations or bringing programs there that might be beneficial for bringing together different audiences and perspectives.
Well, I think you've been a terrific guest. You're doing some terrific things. So, and that's what we like to hear on this show in particular. So, Nikki,
Yeah.
I appreciate you so much for being on here, and again, for being brave and making a difference in people's lives more than you know. So, Nikki Murphy has been my guest. Her book is Home for Hurricanes. Again, I suggest that you jump on Amazon and grab that, or give it a listen. And my name is Nick Coleshill, and the host of That Sounds Terrific. And thanks again, Nikki.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us in another episode of That Sounds Terrific. Don't forget to check out the show notes and our website at thatsoundsterrific.com to find the contact information and the best ways to volunteer with the organizations that we feature. If you know someone that is doing terrific things and think they should be featured in a future episode, be sure to email us their name, contact info, and short description of what they're doing at thatsoundsterrific@gmail.com. If you like our show, give us a 5-star rating and give us some social media love by liking our Facebook page, That Sounds Terrific. Follow us on Twitter at Sounds Terrific 2 and Instagram at Sounds Terrific. We love hearing your feedback on how to make our show sound even more terrific. Till next time.